Saul Griffith is the founder and chief scientist for Rewiring America, a nonprofit dedicated to widespread electrification and decarbonization. His new book, Electrify, an Optimist's Playbook for Our Clean Energy Future, not only shows how we can fix the pollution and the inefficiencies resulting from our fossil-fueled society, but also how we can pay for the solutions that are going to make our lives, our health, and our wallets better off. Saul Griffith, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Good morning, and thank you.
Well, tell me a little bit more about your background in energy. How did you get into all of this?
I think my childhood shaped me to care about the earth in a way that made me want to grow up and try to keep the good things of earth pristine. So my mother raised me to love all the critters and all the national parks. I had a predilection. I worked in heavy industry as a very young adult. So my first job was in a steel mill, and my second job was in an aluminum smelter. So I sort of appreciated, in some very visceral sense, we like steel for things and aluminum for stuff, and they're big, violent industries that use a huge amount of energy. So I very much was aware of the challenges. And then after, roaming the world and doing grad school, unclear which one I learned the most at, I settled down in California and focused on energy and energy issues, because energy is such a huge component of climate, and have worked on wind energy, solar energy, heating and cooling systems, all manner of projects over the last 20 years, and built a bunch of companies specifically on the solution side of the climate challenge.
Yeah, you've built a ton of companies that have worked on those climate and energy solutions. What made you want to write a book, especially Electrify?
I feel like the global conversation around climate solutions is very confused, and I wanted to make the reality a lot simpler. I'm very much a person who goes by the numbers. So for 20 years, my hobby has been energy data, which I understand makes me some kind of tragic nerd. But I really felt that I could help people understand the big picture and the little pictures of climate in a new way by writing the book Electrify. Focus not just on the large scale problem and the big machines. So, climate is going the wrong way. We have coal-fired power stations, but really helping us understand how all of those things weave all the way through into our personal lives and what we do in our own homes, and what the real solutions need to look like.
I mean, the book is full of all this fascinating data and charts and tables and analyses. How did you get access to all of this data?
So nearly everything in the book is publicly available data. So honestly, anyone could have written it if they had patience to wade through tens of thousands of pages of footnotes from the Energy Information Administration and the Department of Energy and the EPA and even the Bureau of Statistics and other things. So I guess I enjoy the analytical side of that, and I like reading the footnotes, and so that's where it all came from.
Well, as you know, the Energy Information Administration was created during the 1970s as a result of the energy crises. We actually did a two-part series on the 70s energy crises earlier this year that showed how the decisions made during that decade influenced America's energy policies for the next 50 years. And you write in Electrify that the 70s energy crisis also influenced the way people think about energy, and that thinking is hurting our ability to truly combat climate change. So what are the characteristics of this 70s way of thinking that you're talking about?
Well, there's a few, but let's start with the obvious one. So oil crisis happened, lands on Nixon's desk. There is no Department of Energy. There is no Energy Information Administration. So he passed it off to the best boffins he had at the time, and that was a group known as the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy. They were sort of planning the peaceful use of nuclear power to make America bountiful with unlimited, too cheap to meter nuclear energy. And they did the analysis and showed that 15% of the crisis was a supply side shortage. So that we were missing 15% of the oil that would have come from the Middle East. And the most immediate solution was to make cars 15% more efficient and to make our appliances and homes 15% more efficient. This got literally translated into our first climate policies, which was CAFE fuel economy standards and the Energy Star appliance. And everyone who has owned a car or bought a washing machine is familiar with those things. And they were good because they did help us slow down our rampant energy use, but they gave us the efficiency narrative. And part of the reason they gave us the efficiency narrative is because all of this happened on the backside of Earth Day in 1970, the burgeoning environmentalist movement that was probably as big as it ever was in that moment, latched onto this messaging of efficiency. But then it became culturally divisive because some people read efficiency as you're going to take away my car and you're going to make me live in a colder, smaller house. So there's that, the cultural war was set up around efficiency there. But also efficiency doesn't get you to zero emissions. And we need transformation now because we don't want to have no vehicles and no homes, which is the zero emission via efficiency plan. So we need transformation, and then most of the book is about how electrification and then providing it with clean electricity is the way. I won't quite say you can have your cake and eat it too, but you can have your electric vehicles and your oversized home and still get to zero emissions through electrification.
Yeah, Electrify, it looks at both the supply and the demand side changes that need to be made in order to truly decarbonize. And I want to talk about both, obviously, but I want to start with supply because I think that's what most people are familiar with. Everyone knows that fossil fuels warm the planet and pollute local communities. But one of the fascinating things I learned from Electrify is just how inefficient our entire energy system is as a result of our reliance on fossil fuels. So how much less energy would we need today if we just abandoned fossil fuels and switched to clean energy to power our lives?
So when they were first studying the energy system to try and figure out what to do, they had to define the energy system in terms of what they knew. So we even defined the system in terms of quadrillions of British thermal units, which is a pretty obscure unit. And we talked about on the supply side, tons of coal, cubic feet of natural gas, barrels of oil equivalent, because they were the input fuels. And then that was known as the primary energy inputs to the economy. And then they would measure the efficiency of how all of those things were used, and they would decide how much of it was waste and how much it was effectively used. But a huge amount of it is waste because fundamentally, burning oil in a car to move the car, you only get 20 to 30% of the energy out of the oil. Burning coal in a power station, you only get 25 to 35% of the energy out of the coal as delivered electricity. Same with natural gas, you get about 40 to 50%, so it's considered more efficient and lower carbon emissions than coal, but you're still losing half the energy. If instead of looking at that supply side view, which is sort of a look at the big machines, you look from the demand side backwards. So you think about everything that's at the end of that. So all the motorcycles, all the cars, all the homes, all the furnaces, all the hot water heaters. And you say, well, what if we do these? What if we electrify all of those things? Then, with a heat pump, you can get about 3 times as much energy per unit of primary energy as you can with natural gas. Like I said, with cars, you get 3 times as many miles with an electric vehicle. If you work backwards from electrification to the supply side, you can see that you could do everything we do in the American economy today without shrinking anything or making it colder at about 40% of the energy input we use today. And curiously, you could then on top of that do the things that we typically associate with efficiency, like double glazing windows and insulating our homes. And then we'd even use less than that. So really, electrification is the efficiency we always wanted, but because we defined the entire conversation about the energy system in terms of barrels of oil and natural gas, we weren't quite able to see that.
And it's wild to see just how much energy it requires to get those fossil fuels to make energy, whether that's through extraction or through transportation.
Yeah, this is crazy. And so I've looked right into the details, and nearly 8 or 9% of US energy flow is using fossil fuels to find, mine, refine, and transport fossil fuels. So, nearly 3 or 4% of US energy flow is using oil to turn oil into gasoline and diesel. And we don't count that oil on the CAFE fuel economy stance. What it really means is the car that you think gets 25 miles per gallon is only getting about 20 miles per gallon. Similarly, 2% of US energy flow is used on drilling rigs to find oil and natural gas. About 1% of US energy flow, just under 1%, is using natural gas to pump natural gas through millions of miles of pipeline. Close to 0.25% is using diesel on freight rail to move coal from where it's mined to where it's burned. So all of those things add up, like I said, to maybe 8%. But if you included the steel to make all of those pipelines and platforms, etc., it's probably north of 10%. So it's a pretty big commitment, and you get a lot of those discounted if you go to an all renewable future. Although we should be careful and say, yes, you'll also need energy to make solar panels. You'll also need energy to make wind turbines. But curiously, it turns out we're probably going to need proportionally a little bit less to do the renewable energy in an electrified future.
Well, it's going to take a lot of renewable energy to totally decarbonize. According to the EIA, wind and solar are used to create less than 10% of the electricity generated today. And ramping up renewables means installing a lot of solar panels and wind turbines, which take up a lot more space than coal and natural gas plants. So do we have the space to install the amount of renewable energy generation that we need?
We do. And I think it's hard. People have always talked about, if I only had 200 miles by 200 miles in the middle of Nevada, I could power the whole country. But I don't think those analogies work very well for us. The area of all of the roads in the US is about 1% of the landmass. And the area of all of the rooftops of all of our homes is about 0.5%. And if you covered all of those and maybe just a little bit more with solar, that's enough to power the entire country. And so as I think about it, driving through the countryside, well, what we need to do if we're going to do it all with solar is I need to have another road next to this road that's all solar cells. And I think that gives you a better sense within your community and geography of what the real need is. It won't be exactly like that because we'll probably use some nuclear, some geothermal, some offshore wind. But it does give you a sense that the scale is large, but it's not so large that it's unachievable. In fact, America is one of the countries that's really blessed with great renewable resources and will have a slightly easier job than, for example, Northern Europe. Just one last comment on that land area. I used to think that was quite a lot, the 1.5%, 2% that you have to dedicate to solar and wind. But if you actually, we have millions of miles of pipelines and transmission lines already installed around the country, and they have setbacks. So, freight rail, for example, you need to have 40 to 80 feet either side of the railway line, and natural gas and oil pipelines need to have 50 to 100 feet on either side of it as a buffer zone. And if you take all of those setbacks that we already have for the existing fossil fuel infrastructure, it's very close to the amount that you need for renewables. So in some respects, we're already dedicating this amount of land to our existing fossil infrastructure. So it's not like it's more, in fact. You can sort of imagine then maybe that might be an opportunity for renewal where we start to reuse those dedicated spaces already in the transformation, because and that even has sort of workforce and training components, so that people who were traditionally working on maintaining the oil pipelines can maintain the long distance transmission lines and the solar cells that sit underneath them. So I think I'm starting to see more opportunity, and I think we all need to use our imaginations and see those opportunities if we're going to get from here to there, so to speak.
Yeah, and I often come across debates on Energy Twitter and elsewhere on the internet about which is the quote unquote key to decarbonization: distributed energy resources like rooftop solar, or utility scale renewable energy like fields of wind turbines or massive solar installations. So, from your analyses, what's your take on this debate?
Yes, and so uh, you can almost, if you have a very large roof and you live in the suburbs of LA with a population density of 1,500 to 2,000 people per square mile, you can probably put enough solar on your roof to offset the entire energy cost of running the 1.88 cars in the average US garage, all of your heating, all of your cooling. But that's not the norm to have that larger roof in the middle of LA, and it's to ignore the fact that that's only covering the energy that your household uses. It's not covering the energy required to make those electric vehicles and to make those washing machines and dryers and kitchen accessories. So the answer to that is, I think we can do a lot more than people suspect with distributed resources. Absolutely, those distributed resources are going to be the cheapest energy in the system because they eliminate a lot of the cost of transmission and distribution. Little known fact in the US is the average electricity cost is about 13.8 cents per kilowatt hour delivered. And close to 8 cents of that is the cost of transmission and distribution. Most of it being the distribution. There's 185 million of those utility poles in the country. That's a lot. It's like one utility pole for every 2 people in the country, and they require a lot of maintenance, and that's where a lot of the electricity distribution costs comes from. So by putting the solar on your roofs in your community, over our churches, over the car parks at Walmart, over our commercial buildings, we eliminate a lot of those long distance generation runs. And I think there's good news there. But all told, I still believe that's probably a quarter to a third of all of our energy supply. One half if you're enormously ambitious and you start putting solar over the parking spaces as well. But I think that sort of bounds it. And then we still need industrial renewables for everything else.
Well, another topic of debate in the energy world that you're very familiar with is the importance of nuclear power on our path to decarbonization. Based on your research, do you think nuclear can play a major role in reducing carbon emissions from the electricity sector?
Nuclear absolutely can play a role, and even a major role. Will we let it play a major role is more political and social than it is technical. The technical limitation on nuclear as it operates today is the water required to cool the nuclear power plants. It's like our coal and our natural gas plants, all of our nuclear plants are thermoelectric, meaning you heat water, you run a turbine, and that's how you convert heat to electricity. But already today, 40% of American water goes through a thermoelectric power plant. And that's already leads to, and then you heat that water up and then you put it back into ecosystems, but you can't heat the water up indefinitely and pump it back into rivers without hurting the fish. So we're sort of at the limit of the total amount of thermoelectric cooling we can do sensibly. And if you just said, well, what if we produced all of our electricity with the nuclear power with the current amount of water that we can put through, and you'll get about 500 gigawatts, which is about a third of what you'd need if you electrified everything. So then you either need to say, well, there'll be a new technology. Everyone talks about these small modular reactors. That's actually not the new technology that we really need. What we really need is non-water-based cooling of these systems. There are some proposals for nuclear technology that won't require all that water. We should absolutely be looking at those. But I think if you're saying, again, this is a yes and issue, nuclear is not all of the answer. I think you can sanely bound it, like by what I just said, maybe up to a quarter or a third if we're unbelievably ambitious and we get a little bit lucky and some new technologies fall the right way. But probably 5 to 10% at a minimum, because I think, a country that likes to have a nuclear arsenal is not going to give up on peaceful nuclear electricity, because these things have co-evolved and they kind of both need each other to exist. So I think there will be some in the US, let's call it 10 to 25% as a spread. Again, the US could do it with 100% renewables, but not every country is blessed as America. Maybe Russia, Canada, America, Australia. You kind of get the impression here big countries can do it without nuclear. It gets pretty hard in Southeast Asia with the population densities being super high. It gets very hard in Northern Europe where the winters are long. So I don't see a way for the world to go forward with no nuclear if we wish to maintain something that looks like our modern lives. You know, if we dial back on our use of cars and heat and smaller homes and things, we could do it all without nuclear. But it's a big, nuanced debate that involves the hopes and desires of 8 billion people and the fears of the nuclear conversation.
Well, we also hear about hydrogen and the promise of so-called green hydrogen. What role will green hydrogen play in our decarbonization efforts?
Oh, I almost got in a fist fight on a panel yesterday with the head of the Australian Hydrogen Council. I'm sympathetic to hydrogen. I've even developed hydrogen technologies, and in fact, sold some hydrogen tank technology to all the world's automakers. So I'm pretty intimate with the physics of hydrogen. In fact, also I'm currently working on a project to compress hydrogen. That said, the hydrogen conversation is out of control and it's a huge distraction. And if we can, it's important to go into that for a few reasons. So Germany and Japan both struggled in World War II for lack of a high density liquid fuel. So they didn't have domestic oil. So they've been looking for something with high energy density. And licking their wounds and thinking about national security, those two countries have been very active in that we have to have hydrogen, because in theory, hydrogen 123 megajoules per kilogram has 2.5 times the energy density of diesel, 45 megajoules per kilogram. So it sounds like this perfect thing, and those countries have overinvested in that. And they also like the idea that if you're buying hydrogen, you can buy it from 10 different countries, which means that you have redundant supply chains. But if you're buying electricity from Norway and that's your only connection to the world, then Norway can cut it off and you're in big trouble. So it's these historic and geopolitical fears that make everyone really, or some people really, really in favor of hydrogen. Then, of course, the natural gas industry is like, oh, it's a gas, we know how to deal with gas. And either cynically or stupidly, I'm not sure which, have been very, very pro hydrogen because it sounds a little bit like what they already know how to do. And it appeases their unions who are like, yeah, we're fitters and turners, we know how to make pipes, lobby for us for hydrogen. But I think all of this is to ignore the basic physics of hydrogen. To do green hydrogen starts with electricity anyway, which you've sort of mentioned. The problem is that the electrolyzers is only about 70% efficient. Then you have to compress the stuff because hydrogen as a gas is very low density. It takes 15% of the energy in the hydrogen to compress it down to have that 123 megajoules a kilogram in a little carbon fiber tank. Then you either burn it and then you'll only get 50% of the energy out, or you run a fuel cell, you'll only get 70% of it out. You multiply all of those inefficiencies, and for 1 unit of energy of electricity, you'll get 0.3 to 0.5 units of energy out back into what you wanted to do anyway. So if you want to drive a car, why you would go back down into hydrogen, get 30% of the energy back out to run an electric vehicle is a little bit insane, especially if you tie that to the conversation we just had about land area. If you use significant amounts of hydrogen, like 50% of the world's energy supply comes from hydrogen, you're going to need to double or triple the number of solar cells and wind turbines and et cetera out there. So yes, we need hydrogen for a few things. What's it good for? Making ammonia, NH3. Maybe it is the thing that's going to help us make steel, which we use a lot of. But there are other electrochemical processes that don't need hydrogen. We might need hydrogen for a couple of industrial processes that are super high heat, but it's not absolutely necessary. And there's a few people that like to tell you that we're going to fly airplanes with hydrogen and have giant ships with hydrogen. But having owned a hydrogen vehicle, which scared the willies out of me, every time you're filling the tank on this thing, you're like, oh, this is like, 4,000 PSI hydrogen. And you could hear the tank expanding as you're filling it with this high pressure gas, and you're standing next to this thing saying, well, the first time I die is when my chest collapses because the pressure wave from the ruptured tank makes my lungs collapse. The second time you die, you suffocate because there's no air around you, there's just hydrogen. And then the third time you die you're going to burn to death. And I just think people underappreciate that that's not a fantastic user interface for a vehicle of any description. So I struggle to believe we're going to get really, really comfortable with moving around huge amounts of hydrogen and then flying airplanes and boats powered on it, because the user experience is challenging.
Well, let's talk about something that's a little less scary and you're a little bit more optimistic about than hydrogen, which is these demand side changes. And when most people talk about the demand side of the decarbonization equation, they talk about behavioral changes or incremental efficiency improvements like you discussed earlier. But you call for a complete transformation of our energy consuming infrastructure, which is to electrify everything. So what do you mean by electrify everything?
If I could step back a couple of thoughts here. Many people have heard of these divestment campaigns. This is, again, evidence to this 70s narrative we have, and that it was very much supply side. And when you hear climate debates on the national stage, it's about how do we replace coal? How do we replace oil? But they're thinking about the small number of big machines, coal plants, natural gas plants, LNG terminals on the supply side of the equation. And anyway, so people let's divest from all of these fossil fuel supply companies, and they name the 100 oil and gas companies that are responsible for 60% of our emissions or whatever it is. What I find super curious is that those same people don't have the same relationship with Ford or Toyota. Toyota makes engines and machines that consume and produce 2% of the world's CO2. So does Ford. They should absolutely be listed in this list of supply side evil co's. But we don't, because they're so close to a thing that we know and love, like my F-150 or my Toyota Camry. So I feel like this supply demand question has a little bit been divided because it's convenient for our own conscience to imagine that it's not my Ford truck's problem, it's the coal plant. So what do I mean by demand side? And you just heard me say there's a small number of huge machines on the supply side. They're controlled by governments and big business, and they have very big lobbying and interest groups. The demand side is a huge number of small machines. It's 250 million trucks and cars sitting in our driveways. It's 128 million households, 70 million natural gas furnaces, and 60 million natural gas cooking machines, and I think 70 or 90 million natural gas hot water heaters. So there's this huge number of demand side machines. And if you took all of our households and you take the decisions that we make around the kitchen table about what energy source we use, and then I'm going to confuse everyone because I'm going to use the word infrastructure in a new way here. But those things in your personal life that use fossil fuels are kind of the infrastructure of your climate life. They're decisions you make every decade. So it's the 1.88 cars in your driveway. It's the furnace or boiler in your basement. It's the hot water heater that's in your garage or your basement. It's whether or not you have a natural gas dryer, and it's what you cook with your kitchen. All of these machines last 10 to 20 years. Additionally, it's whether or not you have solar on the roof. American rooftops are mostly made out of asphalt, which is a byproduct of oil. Strangely, they have to get replaced every 15 years. We could be choosing to replace those with solar. So what I like to say is we've had 50 years of the environmentalist narrative that if you purchase enough stainless steel water bottles and you dial down the thermostat and wear a hair shirt, it's going to be okay, which has made us focus on the wrong small decisions in our lives, which is almost incapacitating when you're in the supermarket and you look at all the tuna and you're like, well, which one is actually dolphin friendly? And you have incapacitating consumer guilt. Like this is the experience of trying to be an environmentalist today. Whereas the really, truly impactful decisions you make are those 6 decisions that you make every 10 years around your car, etc. If we make those correctly, those 6 decisions are responsible for 42% of our CO2 emissions in the US. And curiously, just did this for Australia, it's about 40% of Australia's domestic emissions. So what we need to do, we can decarbonize the supply side all we like, But unless we actually decarbonize this demand side, because supply equals demand, we never get to the goalposts. And so we need to actually understand that our infrastructure in our homes is as important as the infrastructure out there on the grid. Because if it doesn't get to electrified, we're still intoning magic to try and decarbonize. So the project is, over the next 20 years, is to replace our 250 million vehicles as they retire with electric vehicles. Same with our furnaces, same with our hot water heaters, same with our kitchen appliances, etc. So it turns out this is not to blame the victim here and blame the householder, but it's to say, actually, you have a really positive, active role that's central and critical in fixing climate change. And it's about changing your own personal infrastructure so that you're running as many things off your rooftop solar as possible, and they're all electrified.
Yeah, and you talk about in the book that this personal infrastructure and most of our fossil fuel infrastructure now is resulting in what you call committed emissions. So can you describe what are committed emissions?
Committed emissions is a relatively new concept in the academic world of climate debate. And what does a committed emissions mean? It's the emissions that a machine will emit over the course of its lifetime. So if you bought a new gasoline-powered car last year, it'll probably live for about 22 years, and it will be emitting CO2 emissions the whole time. If somebody built a natural gas-fired power plant last year, it will emit emissions for 40 or 50 years. A coal plant built in China in 2020, sadly, will emit emissions until 2070 if it's allowed to live out its natural life. The conundrum for climate is that if you add up the committed emissions of every machine that exists on the planet today, it takes us to about 1.8 degrees, plus or minus. So in fact, to get to 1.5 degrees, we've had to cheat the accounting. And this is a little bit sad, but we've cheated that accounting by allowing it with the methodology of the IPCC negative emissions, which means carbon capture and sequestration, or direct air capture, or land use changes, etc. But the amount of committed emissions, the amount of negative emissions we've intoned to deal with this uncomfortable situation of our committed emissions is probably larger than is physically possible. So I'm an advocate for us being a little more honest with ourselves. And you'll see a lot of its dishonesty, I promise you, in Glasgow in a few weeks. They will mostly solve their rhetoric with accounting, cheating the accounting with things like negative emissions. But I'm a fan for saying, look, let's discount most of those negative emissions. It's not going to happen. Understand that this is about our committed emissions and about the machines we have. Figure out which of those. This, by the way, is the origin of why people say we should retire coal early, because you get a huge amount of bang for your buck, because they're very high emitting machines that live for a long time. So let's retire all of them early. But even if you retire all of them early, we're still on target for 1.6 or 1.7 without negative emissions. And may I say, that's if you intellectually have the model that no fossil fueled machine will ever be born again. But remember that last year in the US, only 1 or 2% of vehicles were electric. So we're still a huge effort away from being able to make sure that everyone's new vehicle is electric. In fact, the Biden Clean Cars for America ambition was 50% electric vehicles by 2030, which still means we're going to bring into the world 100 million more diesel or gasoline vehicles before we stop doing that stupidity. So it's the committed emissions, these machines as infrastructure is now absolutely critical to how we think about getting the best climate outcome we can. And we really need, at Rewiring America, this is what we advocate for in the book. I describe it a lot. Like, we need intellectually to be in the place. How do we, as fast as possible, make it sure that we can have an electric vehicle available at every purchasing decision, these every decade purchasing decisions? How do you make sure that finance is available so that if you're a low income person, you go to the car dealership, the financing is available that helps you get into that electric car, that makes it as cheap as the gasoline one at the dealership, that also locks in savings for you over the lifetime of that car? How do we make sure that there's enough contractors, right? If your water heater failed today in most of America, a contractor would show up to replace it, and you'd say, oh, can I have an electric heat pump, please? And they'd say, what? And then after they said what, and you describe what an electric heat pump is, they'd say, no, sorry, that's too hard. How about this nice, shiny natural gas one? I can have it installed tomorrow. So our committed emissions problems and thinking about the world in terms of like, we have to get to 100% replacement rate of everything forces you to really think through, oh, workforce training. We need more contractors who know how to install blah, and finance. Wow. Yeah. If 40% of Americans who buy an air conditioner buy it under duress. Same with water heaters. It's probably true that your partner is pregnant. It's the middle of winter. And so they say, I'd like a new hot water heater tomorrow, please, or a new air conditioner tomorrow, please. And you say, well, can you just wait 6 weeks so we can get in line for the one contractor in town who'll do a heat pump? And your partner will probably, if she's like my partner, say absolutely not. I'd like a hot shower tomorrow, please. And so anyway, but I actually really think it's healthy for us in a climate solution sense to understand that these are the practical on the ground problems that are preventing us from making the right choices that lock in the right behaviors into the future, which is electrification of our end users.
And you touched on financing being such a important part of this. I mean, a new electric car, solar panels, electric water heater, even an induction stove, they're all expensive. And few people have the ability to go out and just upgrade their homes right now with this stuff. So how does the government ensure that everyone has the ability to electrify their personal infrastructure?
Yeah, so this is really the challenge of all challenges. So in 2021, and I've just done this study in the US last year, and I'm just finished doing this study in Australia. So what does it cost or save the average household if they flip everything to electric? And the reality is that an electric car is $10,000 or $15,000 more than the petrol gasoline equivalent today. And an induction stove probably costs you $500 more in the store than the natural gas one, but it costs you $1,000 more for the installation because you've got to run a high voltage conduit line across the bottom of your house and connect it to your kitchen. Solar in the US is still quite expensive, $3 a watt. So it'd be $30,000 for a system that's big enough to supply power to a lot of these things. In the US, it's probably $100,000 more than you would spend otherwise, which sort of means if in the US you currently buy a luxury vehicle for your daily driver, a BMW or a Mercedes, you can absolutely afford to decarbonize, and you're just a planet fucking hypocrite if you're choosing not to buy a Chevy Bolt instead of that Mercedes S-Class. But that's just to say the state of play today. So if you could afford those $100,000 things today, and you had a FICO score that allowed you to finance that against your home mortgage or against etc., you'd be paying a few $1,000s a year more than the $5,000 a year, which is roughly the average US spending on all of your energy. But cost of batteries is falling very, 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 very quickly. Bloomberg, New Energy Finance, and other people who watch the auto industry believe 2025, 2026, the cost of the electric car in the showroom will start to be lower than the cost of the internal combustion engine. The performance of the induction cooktops and the performance is going up, cost is coming down. Same with heat pumps, performance is going up, cost is coming down. You can really see a point. In Australia, the crossover point is 2023, 2024. In the US, the crossover point is 2025, where as long as you can afford the upfront financing, these things will start saving you thousands of dollars a year in your energy bills and cost of ownership of all of these things. So the problem goes from one of, wealthy people's choice and prestige projection by buying electric Teslas and et cetera, to one that becomes just basically good household economics in the middle of this decade. And then the question is, well, how do you help someone, how do you help a single mother in Ohio who's got a FICO score of 500 to enjoy participating in this energy transition, doing her bit for climate, her bit for her children, when she probably won't be able to borrow the money to buy these things, and she'll be on the secondhand market waiting for a secondhand electric vehicle, etc. So in to me, this is where the climate justice, climate equity question rubber really hits the road. It's, are we going to allow everyone to enjoy this transition, or are we going to make it only possible for the wealthiest 10% of homes for the first 5 years, and then allow cultural divisions to start to exist because no one else can afford it? Or are we going to proactively develop the market and have governments provide subsidies and rebates and tax incentives to help everyone afford this now? And because I am a huge advocate, that's the only way that we get enough climate action fast enough. I think this issue could kill us if we allow it to become the cultural wedge that's already being trying to be exploited by the natural gas industry, to have them say, well, you can't afford that induction stove, that's just nonsense. So natural gas is here to save you, just that clean blue flame that gives your children respiratory illness. Oh, sorry, I mean that clean blue flame, by us.
Well, are there historic precedents that we can look to that would indicate such public, government financing options are possible?
Which brings me to my favorite American president, Teddy Roosevelt, who really, in two ways, and hopefully you'll let me go long and explain the two ways that I think he created precedents that the world needs on climate change. So the first was the Great Depression hit. At that time, debt and mortgages were a very new concept, only a few decades old. And most American mortgages were a 5-year mortgage with a balloon payment at the end. And the problem with the stock market crash is that a lot of people missed their balloon payment. Huge number of people lost their homes. The construction industry collapsed. Unemployment was 20%. And Roosevelt understood that a huge amount of the employment in the US was in the construction industry, and it was in the regions. And so he needed to get money out to the regional banks. And so they invented Fannie Mae through the Federal Housing Authority, which was the federal government saying, we will guarantee the loans in case of default so that the banks took a lot less risk. And we'll also make sure that the loan rate is unprecedentedly low. In effect, they invented the modern 25-year mortgage, and they invented the loan guarantees, and they made the largest pool of capital ever to exist on Earth still today, the American mortgage market. And that created enough liquidity to get people back building. The reason earlier in this conversation I was talking about your cars and your water heaters and the solar on your roof and your battery in your basement as infrastructure is because in some respects that declaration of the Federal Housing Authority in 1936 was the American suburbs will be infrastructure worthy of special classes of credit so that we can, invest in it. And that we now need to apply that same philosophy to this other infrastructure, which is our domestic end use energy infrastructure, which is, to say it a bunch on this show so we all have muscle memory, it's our EVs, it's our solar rooftops, it's our hot water heaters, our furnaces, our kitchens, and our laundries. So we need to we need a similar thing to Fannie Mae for these things if we're going to do it with the speed and scale necessary. And then the second reason to intone Roosevelt is that, he got a lot of crisis fell on his desk. In 1939, Churchill called him and said, oh no, we're screwed. The Germans have taken Dunkirk and we've got no boats left. And by the way, the Germans are looking at our Navy, and if they come and pinch our Navy, they're going to sail across the Atlantic and get you. Roosevelt's like, oh, wow, that's a problem. Churchill emphasized that it was a war of machines. It was going to be, Germany had built tanks and airplanes. No other army in the world had. So this is why Hitler was poised to win, because it was a war of machines. Roosevelt viscerally understood that and started a project called the Arsenal of Democracy. It took until about 1941 to get going. This is the engagement of all American industry to build the critical machines to fight this war. At that time, the critical machines were Liberty ships. I forget the name of the bombers, the big ones, the munition tanks, jeeps, guns and bullets. They were the critical munitions. We've had our Dunkirk moment on climate. It's time to fight the war against this thing. We need an arsenal of democracy that very rapidly ramps up the production, except this time it's not bullets, it's batteries. And if you think about a bullet, what is a bullet? It's a little canister with really high energy density materials in it. it's almost exactly a battery in size and shape and chemical content in some abstract sense. So we need batteries, not bullets. We need wind turbines, not bombers. We need electric vehicles, not jeeps and tanks. And we need to do it really quickly if we're going, because of that committed emissions problem we talked about earlier. We need, hopefully in 5 years, at most 10, be ready to be able to produce all of these machines at the scale that not only decarbonizes America, but helps the rest of the world decarbonize. Like, that's our only way to an outcome under 2 degrees requires some effort that looks like that.
And all those technologies are available today. We've talked about this several times on this podcast. It's, solving the climate crisis is not a technological problem. It's really a problem of political will, which we just don't seem to have right now in this country. And in Electrify, you point out that 85% of fossil fuel production takes place in states that typically vote Republican. Decarbonization means phasing out fossil fuels and the companies and the jobs needed to extract and burn those fuels. So how do you think we can get voters in red states here in America to get behind the decarbonization and electrification efforts that you're proposing?
I'm going to avoid the culture war question, because I really don't know how you get the kid who lives in Kentucky who enjoys rolling coal in his F-350 and blasting black exhaust at passing pedestrians. I'm not quite sure how you solve that problem, but let's talk about, at the end of the day, the problem. It's about the money. So I did this first in 2016, but also did it in 2020. I mapped the results of the US election to the US energy supply. And it was strangely true in both years. 85 to 87% of oil, coal, and natural gas are found and mined and refined in red states. So they have you would then easily believe the narrative that they have the most to lose in the energy transition. But why do they have all of the oil and all the coal and all the natural gas? It's because they have all of the land. And, again, harking back to the conversation earlier, we're going to need a lot of land for a lot of wind turbines and a lot of solar. And we're going to need a lot of factories making a lot of EVs, making a lot of induction stoves and a lot of heat pumps. It turns out that land that's big enough for those industrial activities and the industrial energy production, as well as the manufacturing, also fall in red states. And in fact, if you do the analysis a little bit further, which I did in 2020, is the red states are already leading on wind and solar because they're big. So they actually have the most to win. So I think we need to help that narrative. And I think there are a lot of enlightened people in Texas, for example, who are seeing this, but like, the red states have a lot to win here. They can still continue to be the producers of our food and of our energy and have a critical and central place in the American economy. I think what they hear from the bleeding heart liberals is, you have no place anymore in our economy, et cetera, et cetera. But we should just turn that cultural narrative on its head and say, no, absolutely. You're productive, you're practical, you have the land. Let's help you build that into the nation we need to be. I think the other problem that's really at the bottom of this, that's more insidious, are it's the proven reserves problem. So what is proven reserves? This is another idea that people need to really understand. And the historical origin is hard. I've nearly found the trace. I've got to read a few more 1,000 pages of footnotes to find the very first time that an oil driller, and I think it was an oil driller, probably in the 1880s, 1890s, probably in the South, had drilled one well, was getting oil coming out, but needed to drill the next well, but didn't have the cash to do it. So went to the bank and said, look, this well is producing this many barrels of oil per day. Can you please loan me the money for another well using that original well's proven reserves, meaning it's provably making this much oil every day, so that I can finance my next well. We applied that principle to fossil fuels. And so sitting on the bank balance of a huge number of fossil fuel companies, tradable value in the market is proven reserves of stuff that is in the ground. this is really the most wicked and the most hard problem. Asking those people to leave those fossil fuels in the ground is asking them to write off trillions of dollars of value that they've already financed. So this is one of the effects of financializing the economy, right? It's the worst effect. I think we need, if there's to be a grand political bargain in my mind, and I'm not a political genius and I'm not Churchill and I'm not Roosevelt, but I wish there was one alive today, you would figure out how to make the giant political compromise something about absolving these people of those proven reserves, in a sense, buying them out, in order to give them the capital to participate in the new economy so that they feel like their interests are aligned with solving climate change, as opposed to right now, they're told they're evil. There's all of these kids on campuses that are running out, preventing their campus endowments from investing in fossil fuels because of this problem. So we're not engaging the workforce and the capital that is most engaged in our energy industry today. So I think at the bottom of the day, at the end of the day, this is the original sin on climate change, and we need to figure out the political compromise that gets us over this.
Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, you look at what's happening right now in Congress. Coming up with a political compromise seems nearly impossible. And honestly, it's not just the Republicans. It's Democrats too, like Senator Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, that are just they're doing everything they can to spend less money on decarbonization and keep the fossil fuel industry alive. I mean, what do you make of what's happening in American Congress right now as President Biden tries to get major climate legislation passed?
I spent the last 6 months of my life doing hand-to-hand combat with natural gas around this issue and watching this play out through our activities at Rewiring America. And we've been trying to work with, there's some really activist senators out there who are really trying to solve this problem and build their career on it. And Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico is one of them. Chuck Schumer and his office are actively engaged. There's a lot of people who really want to address this problem, but we're failing with the Democrats fighting Democrats before we even get to the Democrats fighting Republicans on this issue. And because of this unbelievable cultural block, there's no Republicans that are willing to step over the aisle, even though there should be a centrist Texan Republican that sees the future and says, oh my Lord, our state will do well with all these wind turbines and all of this solar. But it's an impasse. And the title of my book, I can see it behind you as we do this call. It says An Optimist's Playbook for Our Clean Energy Future. And I fought a little bit with the publisher. I'm not sure that I'm an optimist, although I actually think I am. But the optimist struggles a little bit with these political battles. And I'm watching the same. I'm also sadly engaged in Europe and Australia on very similar policy things. And we're not winning on the ground legislation in any country. And we're about to go to Glasgow, and all of the world leaders are going to want to declare success, right? There's no real option for them to come home and say we've abjectly failed. But despite Biden's administration saying the right thing, we are going to aspire to do 50% emission reductions by 2030. There is nothing in the legislation that's being passed that comes remotely close to that. And I don't think it's for lack of desire or trying from some elements, but the same is true of every other country in the world. So I'm not saying I look forward to it, but I'm intrigued as to how the world leaders are going to spin their commitments in light of the actual legislation that's being passed on the ground. And if I could use this point to emphasize, something I think is absolutely true. The reason is there's still not political consensus and a majority of actual voters who understand this issue enough, want to solve it enough to be in the fight and to be a political voice that moves politicians. I think we live in a terrible political era driven by minute-to-minute polling of people's opinions and attitudes and social media. And if you took the temperature of the polls, it doesn't say, let's do the wartime effort yet. It doesn't say, let's let's do what's required. So I think we need to build, if we're to hope to get there this decade, which we must, we need to figure out how to build the populist movement of probably centrist people. So I think it's by moving middle-class mums and dads and friends to become a political plurality large enough to shift the politics in every country. I really strongly believe this. I can actually see, and this is crazy to you because Americans only experience Australian climate politics from hearing the national headlines. And our federal government is terrible. Australia's peer states on the international stage are petro states like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Russia. Because we export so much coal and we export so much LNG. But that's all you hear. On the ground at state level in Australia, the governments, you could add up, if you took the best policy from every state and you added it up and made it a federal policy, they're on target to hit, nearly total decarbonization by 2035 or 2040. And the reason is because the economics are starting to work there. Australian rooftop solar is the cheapest electricity in the world because it's $1 a watt installed, which is 5 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour on your roof. Crazily, so anyway, 25% of Australian households have now experienced cheaper energy bills because of the revolution, solar. So that enables this political plurality to exist. We are screwing that up in the US. US solar still close to $3 a watt to install, which is 15 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour cost of electricity after financing, which is more expensive than the average electricity price of 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So in the US, it still seems like this is a bad deal. What you would ask yourself, but hey, how come that is true? And it's not because of wages. In fact, the prevailing wage for rooftop solar installers in Australia is closer to $30 or $35 an hour, much higher than your minimum wage. It's actually a regulatory issue. So and a training issue. Australia ran a training program to train solar installers so they would be so good that the government would certify them that they could not only be the installer, but they could be the permitter and the inspector as well. In America, it's a different process. If you want to buy solar, you call up somebody who's a solar installer and you say, I'd like it. And they say, okay, first step, you've got to get a permit. It takes you nearly 6 weeks to get a permit. You get cold feet in that 6 weeks. And so 50% of people don't want to buy it. Even if you get through that 6 weeks and you got the permit, then they come and install it. And then you have to wait another week for an inspector to come and inspect that the job was done. And that adds more cost and more bureaucracy and more truck rolls. And that's why we have very expensive rooftop solar here. So again, let's start looking creatively for answers and solutions. This sounds like I was with a colleague who was testifying in the Senate last week, and Ted Cruz came out to question him and was like, focusing his little Satan eyes on my colleague, like, yada, yada, yada. He's like, all we need is deregulation and allow America to truly enjoy a cheap energy future. He didn't say clean, he said cheap. I wanted to jump, unfortunately, I wasn't on the witness stand. I wanted to jump up and say, hallelujah, Ted. Absolutely. Join the revolution. If you could just deregulate what's wrong with the American solar industry, we win. Right? We got to find those absolutely bizarre win-wins. And so, close to half the cost of most energy in the US is incurred through historic regulatory burden. Right? This energy industry is core to the economy and has existed for long enough that we have rent seekers everywhere. So I'm hoping for the Bipartisan Deregulation for Cheap Clean Energy in America Act of 2023 that's a co-sponsored bill between Ted Cruz and Senator Martin Heinrich.
Well, you may not think of yourself as an optimist, but I'll tell you, you're someone that has a great ability to communicate excitement about this transformation and really inspire a lot of people to combat the climate crisis with the speed and the scale that we need. What to you is most exciting when you think about the opportunity that we are faced with in 2021?
What's most exciting is, I think, is this retail conversation. It's what the household has to win. in North America, if your child represents to a GP, a doctor with a respiratory problem, the first question I'll ask is, do you cook with natural gas? Because it's extremely highly associated with asthma and respiratory problems. So if we electrify the household, it's an immediate win for the people we love, just on a health front. If we electrify and we provide the financing, we do the right things in the right way, every American household will save $2,500 a year, in this decade. And if you add that up, that's $300 billion a year in savings. That's just thinking about the residential and some of the transportation sector. If we also apply that logic to our small businesses and commercial sector, you'd probably go close to doubling that number. Let's just call it $500 billion a year in savings. So what excites me most is the opportunity to flip the narrative. I think the way the Green New Deal came out got flubbed. It came out and was easily skewered because it sounded like it cost a lot, because they mentioned the top number, $20 trillion. And then they attached all of these other social programs. And those social programs are good, but I kind of believe in, I might be a small government Democrat, or I don't even know how to put me on the political spectrum, but like, it would be nice if we could just have clean single topic bills, right? I would trust government more if people weren't trying to pack all sorts of stuff into what's nominally a climate or energy bill. But the Green New Deal got lampooned because, it was easily lampooned. It's going to cost us $20 trillion. We can't afford it. But I think what I just said to you is we can't afford not to do this. We could be saving $500 billion a year, which over that 20-year period that we were thinking of that Green New Deal saves us $10 trillion, not costs us $20 trillion. So I think there's a huge opportunity in that, and in aligning everyone to understand that we have our children's health to win. We have improved home economics. For the average the median American household that spends about $60,000 on everything a year after taxes, that $2,500 is going to be super meaningful, right? They currently spend more on gasoline than they spend on fresh fruit and vegetables, and more electricity than they spend on education, and more on natural gas than they spend on dentistry. So if you can give $2,500 back to every household, that's going to make a huge difference to the quality of life. So we're going to win on health, we're going to win on money, we're going to win on national economy. These jobs implicitly, when you think about the demand side, are going to be in every community. You can't offshore the installation of solar on your roof to Mexico or China because it's an installation in your zip code. The same with installing the electric oven, the battery, etc., the vehicle charging systems, etc. So this is a huge rural and suburban job creator that is blue collar. So this is not some highfalutin, like there's not a nerd from MIT who's going to get up on your roof and get down in your basement. These are like real, honest, traditionally American middle-class jobs, doing jobs you can be proud of in your community, creating a future and protecting everyone's children. And on top of all of that, we've fixed climate as well. So it's like, as far as I can tell, it's win, 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 except that we have politics, culture wars, and dark money between us and success.
Well, all the positives sound incredibly exciting. I'll tell you, reading books, talking about climate, week in, week out, it can get pretty dark, but I'll be honest, I was so inspired and felt really reinvigorated while reading Electrify over the weekend, because you lay out the solutions in such great detail that it all seems so achievable. And we know that acting now to implement these solutions is going to make the world such a better place. And that's exciting. And, we will be sure to link to Electrify in our show notes so that everyone that's listening to this can buy it and be as inspired by it as I was. Where else can our audience follow your work online?
Rewiring America, you can go there, and thanks for the opportunity to plug that. So Rewiring America wants to help build that centrist middle-class army of climate supporters. As we joke, you might know what the AARP is. It's the American Association of Retired People. It's the biggest political lobby in the US. They have their hands in everything from utility rate meetings to setting prescription drug prices. We need a bipartisan organization as big as AARP or bigger if we're going to do it. So go to Rewiring America, sign up to join that army, and then, you know, if you Google me, you can read all sorts of wonky energy nerd essays I've written on Medium and, you know, other places like that. But thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about all this stuff and to plug rewiringamerica.org and to plug Electrify the book. It's been a pleasure.
We'll definitely link to Rewiring America as well. Saul Griffith, thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
All right. Thanks, mate.